Imagine you're an ancient Irish warrior. The night before the most important battle of your life. You walk down to a river ford to clear your head, and in the pale moonlight you see a woman. She's unerringly beautiful, with hair as black as a raven's wing, and she's washing a pile of blood-soaked armor and clothing. You approach and you ask her whose armor she is washing. She looks up from her grim work, her eyes holding a chilling ancient knowledge, and with a voice that sounds like the cracking of bones she tells you, "They're yours. You've just met the washer at the ford. You've just met your death. And you've just come face to face with the Morrigan." This is not a goddess you pray to for victory. This is a goddess who is the chaotic, terrifying, and unpredictable nature of war itself. She is the Phantom Queen, the Great Queen, a primal force of fate, prophecy, and death that haunted the misty battlefields of ancient Ireland long before the gods of Olympus or Asgard were ever written down. She is a shapeshifter, a prophetess, and a warrior who reveled in the fury of combat. But the most terrifying thing about her isn't the death she predicts. It's the one great prophecy she made that wasn't about a single hero's demise, but about the unraveling of the entire world. A prophecy of a time when honor would be lost, seasons would turn on themselves, and humanity would descend into a darkness of its own making. A prophecy that, when you hear it, might sound disturbingly familiar. The question is, was she just a myth, or was she a warning? To understand this terrifying figure, we have to go back to a time shrouded in mist, to an Ireland that existed before written history. This wasn't the quaint green island of postcards. This was a land of deep, impenetrable forests, of mist-choked bogs, and of hundreds of warring tribal kingdoms, each vying for a patch of land, a herd of cattle, or a sliver of honor. Life was brutal and short, and the gods of this land were not gentle. They were forces of nature, as wild and as dangerous as the landscape itself. Into this world came a mythical race of beings known as the Tuatha Dé Danann. They were said to be masters of magic, art, and warfare, who descended from the sky in dark clouds. They weren't gods in the way we think of them today, sitting on golden thrones detached from humanity. They were more like a supernatural aristocracy of powerful, passionate, and often deeply flawed individuals. They fought, they loved, they schemed, and they bled. And among them, the Morrigan was perhaps the most feared and the most respected. But here is where her story becomes a tangled, confusing, and fascinating web. The Morrigan is almost never just one person. She is a triple goddess, a terrifying trinity of divine sisters who embody the full spectrum of war. When the ancient texts speak of the Morrigan, they are often speaking of a singular being but also of a collective, the three who are one. First, there is Bat. Her name translates to crow or vulture. She is the embodiment of the madness and frenzy of battle. She is not the strategist, she is the panic. Bat would fly over the battlefield as a screaming crow, her cries striking terror into the hearts of soldiers, making them drop their weapons and flee, or turn on their own comrades in a fog of confusion. She was psychological warfare given divine form, the sheer horror that makes brave men lose their minds in the heat of combat. Then there is Macha. While also a war goddess, Macha is intrinsically linked to the land itself, to sovereignty, horses, and power. She represents the prize of war, the land, the right to rule. There's a chilling tale where the king of Ulster forces a heavily pregnant Macha to race against his fastest horses. She wins the race but collapses at the finish line, giving birth to twins before dying, and with her last breath, she lets out a scream of agony and rage that lays a curse upon the men of Ulster for 9 generations. The curse dictates that in their time of greatest need, they will be struck down by the pains of childbirth, as helpless as she was. Macha is a reminder that power taken unjustly, that disrespect shown to the sovereign feminine force of the land, will always have a terrible price. The third sister is often cited as Nemain, whose name means venomous or frenzy. She is the spirit of havoc, the personification of the poisonous chaos that war unleashes upon the world. Together, Bat, Macha, and Nemain form the Morrigan. They are the terror before the battle, the bloody chaos during the battle, and the carrion crow feasting on the dead after the battle. They are a complete, horrifying cycle. This triple nature is key. The ancient Celts saw the world in threes: the past, present, and future. Birth, life, and death. Land, sea, and sky. The Morrigan's triplicity shows that she wasn't just a goddess of mindless slaughter. She was a complex deity governing the entire process of conflict, from the political claim to a throne, to the psychological terror of the fight, to the final grim reality of death. But her power went far beyond the battlefield. She was a goddess of sovereignty. In ancient Ireland, the land was seen as a goddess, and a king could not rule without being symbolically married to her. The Morrigan often played this role. She was the ultimate kingmaker and kingbreaker. She would appear to potential rulers, often as an old hag, testing their character, their courage, and their worthiness. If a man proved himself noble and fit to rule, she would transform into a beautiful young woman, granting him her favor and with it, the right to the throne. But if a king became unjust, greedy, or weak, she would withdraw her favor, and his kingdom would wither. His crops would fail, his cattle would sicken, and his enemies would close in. She was the living embodiment of the idea that power is not a right. It is a sacred trust with the land and its people, and breaking that trust leads to ruin. And perhaps her most famous and unsettling power was her ability to shapeshift. This is what made her so terrifyingly omnipresent. She wasn't some distant god you could ignore. She could be the sleek black eel that tangles your feet in the river. She could be the gray she-wolf leading a stampede toward your army's flank. And most famously, she was the crow or raven, the bird of prophecy and death, watching everything from above. When a warrior saw a lone crow on the battlefield, he didn't know if it was just a bird, or if the Phantom Queen herself was watching him, judging him, deciding if this day would be his last. She could be anywhere and anyone. She could appear as a beautiful maiden to seduce and test a hero, or as a withered crone to deliver a fatal prophecy. This constant, looming presence made her a force of inescapable fate, and no one understood that better than Ireland's greatest hero, the demigod Cú Chulainn. He was the only man who ever dared to defy her, to reject her advances and scorn her power. In doing so, he sealed his own doom and began a conflict with a goddess that would become one of the most epic and tragic tales in all of mythology. A story of love, rage, and a terrible unbreakable curse. The stage for this conflict was the Táin Bua Chulainn, the great cattle raid of Cooley. The armies of Queen Medb of Connacht were pouring into Ulster, and standing against them was a single solitary figure, the demigod Cú Chulainn, bound by honor to defend the border fords alone while the rest of Ulster's warriors lay stricken by a curse. Day after day, he fought champion after champion in single combat, a teenage boy holding back an entire invasion through sheer unbelievable martial prowess. He was the pinnacle of the heroic ideal, a blazing sun of glory and violence. And it was here, in his finest hour, that the Morrigan came to collect her due. She did not appear to him as a beautiful woman this time. There would be no more offers of love, only promises of ruin. As Cú Chulainn was locked in a desperate struggle with the warrior Loch Mac Mofemis, a hornless red heifer appeared at the edge of the ford, followed by 50 more, charging directly into the water. They were a stampede of chaos, churning the river into a muddy torrent, their eyes wild and red. Leading them was the Morrigan herself, her divine fury contained in the form of a beast of the earth, intent on trampling the hero who had scorned her. But Cú Chulainn was no ordinary man. Even as he parried Loch's spear, his eyes tracked the lead heifer. With a flick of his wrist, he sent a stone from his sling flying with impossible speed and accuracy. It struck the heifer's leg, shattering the bone with a sickening crack. The goddess screamed, a sound that was half bovine bellow and half divine rage, and she stumbled, her herd scattering in confusion. Cú Chulainn had drawn first blood. He had wounded a goddess, and the battle had only just begun. His opponent, Loch, pressed the advantage, forcing Cú Chulainn deeper into the churning river. The water rose to their waists, slick with mud and blood, and from the depths a new threat emerged. A monstrous black eel, thick as a man's thigh and impossibly long, shot through the water and coiled itself around Cú Chulainn's legs. It was the Morrigan, her form now one of the dark, hidden things that lurked beneath the surface. She squeezed, her powerful body a knot of pure muscle, trying to unbalance him, to drag him down into the suffocating mud where Loch's spear could find his heart. Cú Chulainn staggered, his feet slipping on the slick riverbed. He was trapped, his legs pinned by divine strength. But in his rage, the Ryostrad, the great battle frenzy, began to twist his body. With a roar that shook the riverbanks, he stomped down with all his might, bringing his heel down upon the eel's body. There was a wet, percussive crunch as her ribs and spine were crushed under the force of his divine spasm. The eel uncoiled, writhing in agony, and vanished into the bloody water. Cú Chulainn was free. He had wounded her again. The insult was now deeper, the stakes higher. The fight with Locke reached its climax. Both men were wounded, exhausted, but neither would yield. Just as Cú Chulainn prepared for a final strike, a shadow fell over the ford. A great, gray she-wolf, lean and starved-looking with eyes like burning coals, came bounding down the riverbank. It was her third transformation, the form of the quintessential predator, the hunter, the embodiment of her name, the great queen of phantoms. She didn't hesitate. The wolf lunged, jaws wide, aiming not for his legs or his arms, but for his throat. Cú Chulainn, distracted for a critical second, turned just in time. The wolf's teeth grazed his side, but its primary attack was to drive him back, to give Locke the opening he needed. In that moment, Cú Chulainn made a choice. He ignored the wolf's teeth in his flesh and focused on his mortal opponent, thrusting his legendary spear, the Gi Balga, into Locke's heart. As the champion fell, Cú Chulainn turned his attention to the wolf. With his other hand, he grabbed a stone and hurled it with the last of his strength. It struck the wolf square in the eye, shattering it completely. The beast let out a piercing yelp of pain and fury before turning and fleeing into the woods, leaving behind a trail of divine blood. 3 times she had come for him in 3 different forms, and 3 times, the hero of Ulster had not only survived, but had triumphed, leaving the goddess of war herself broken, blinded, and humiliated. Cú Chulainn stood alone in the ford, surrounded by the carnage, bleeding from a dozen wounds but victorious. He had held the line. He had defeated his enemy, and he had, he thought, defeated the goddess who plagued him. Exhausted and suffering from a burning thirst, he made his way to the riverbank to rest. It was then that he saw her. Not the goddess, not the monster, but a figure that seemed utterly out of place on a battlefield. An old woman, bent and frail, was slowly milking a cow by the side of the path. She was a pathetic sight. She was hobbling as if on a badly broken leg. Her body was hunched over, her posture twisted as if her ribs had been crushed. And as she turned her head, Cú Chulainn saw that one of her eyes was a milky, ruined orb. He was too tired, too consumed by his own pain and glory to see the truth. He only saw an old woman, and he was desperately thirsty. He approached her, his warrior's pride softened by his need. "Old woman," he said, his voice hoarse, "give me a drink of milk." The crone looked up at him with her one good eye, a strange, knowing glint within it. "I will," she croaked, "but you must give me a blessing for each drink." It was a simple request, a common courtesy. Cú Chulainn, the great hero, couldn't refuse. She handed him a wooden pail, filled with rich, white milk from the cow, which he noted had only 3 teats. He drank it down in one long draught. It was the most satisfying thing he had ever tasted. As he finished, he kept his word. "A blessing upon the one who gave this to me," he said. The moment the words left his lips, he heard a soft click, and the old woman stood up a little straighter. The limp in her leg was gone. Puzzled, but still desperate with thirst, he asked for another. Again, she milked the cow and handed him a pail. He drank it just as greedily. "A blessing on the one who provides," he declared. He heard another series of soft cracks, and watched in disbelief as the woman's hunched back straightened, her crushed ribs seemingly mending themselves before his eyes. A cold dread began to creep into his heart. This was no ordinary woman, but his thirst was a fire in his throat, and he asked for a third and final drink. She gave it to him. He drank, the milk now tasting of ashen fear. He gave his final blessing. "Blessings upon you and your herd for all time." Instantly, the clouded ruin of her blind eye cleared, becoming as bright and sharp as the other. She was whole. The frail, stooped crone was gone. In her place stood the Morrigan, her form shifting from the old woman back into the terrifyingly beautiful goddess he had first met. She was no longer wounded, no longer broken. She was perfect, restored to her full, awesome power. And she was smiling. It was not a smile of gratitude. It was a smile of absolute, chilling victory. "You told me once that I was of no help to you," she said, her voice echoing with ancient power. "But you see, great hero, you have been of great help to me. Your own honor has healed me. Your own words have undone your work." Cú Chulainn stared, the Gi Balga feeling like a useless stick in his hand. He had fought her with strength and steel and won, but she had fought back with cunning and magic, and he had lost without even knowing he was in a battle. He had not banished her. He had not defeated her. He had merely proven himself a worthy opponent, a worthy prize. He had wounded the goddess of fate, and then with his own mouth, he had healed her, making her stronger, her resolve harder, her focus on his demise absolute. The curse was not broken. It had just been sealed in his own unwitting blessings. She had promised to be at his death, and now he understood. She would not be a passive observer. She would be the architect. Her true war against him had just begun. It would not be a war of spears and shields but a war of the soul. A war of whispers, of omens, and of fate itself, twisted into a weapon. Cú Chulainn was the greatest warrior alive. A demigod who could enter a battle frenzy so terrifying that friend and foe alike could not distinguish the man from the monster. He was a force of nature. But how do you fight a storm? How do you kill a shadow? How do you defeat a goddess who now holds the strings of your destiny? A destiny you yourself have placed in her hands. The Morrigan vanished from the riverbank, leaving Cú Chulainn healed in body but broken in spirit. The chilling silence she left behind was louder than any war cry. He had faced down armies, but the cold dread that now settled in his heart was an enemy he had never known. For the first time, the Hound of Ulster was afraid. He knew her promise to be at his death was not a threat. It was a simple statement of fact, as inevitable as the setting sun. But now, he understood it was a promise she would actively, malevolently bring to fruition. Her strategy was one of sublime, patient cruelty. She would not simply kill him. That was too easy, too clean for the insult he had dealt her. No, she would dismantle him. She would strip away everything that made him Cú Chulainn. His strength, his pride, his allies, his very identity. She would unmake him piece by piece, until all that was left was a man mortal and terrified, facing a death she had meticulously designed. Her first move was to forge the blades that would end him. Far from the fields of Ulster, in the dark corners of the world where old magic festered, she sought out the children of Calatin. Calatin was a druid of terrifying power whom Cú Chulainn had slain in single combat, along with all 27 of his sons. But Calatin had left behind 3 sons and 3 daughters, and in their hearts grew a hatred for Cú Chulainn that was as black and deep as the Morrigan's own. They were exiles, nursing their vengeance in secret. The Morrigan came to them, not as a queen of battle, but as a whisper of promise. She found them practicing twisted, forbidden arts, and she offered them a tutelage in true darkness. She took them across the world, to the heart of Alba, modern-day Scotland, and to Babylon, the legendary source of all sorcery. Under her guidance, their thirst for revenge was honed into a deadly weapon. They learned spells that could curdle the blood, illusions that could break the mind, and curses that could wither the soul. They became her chosen instruments, 6 poisoned daggers pointed at the heart of Ulster's champion. While his new enemies were being forged in dark magic, Cú Chulainn felt the world begin to shift around him. The Morrigan's influence was a subtle poison, seeping into the land itself. The cries of crows now sounded like his name, a constant mocking chorus. The rivers he had once defended seemed to run sluggish and gray. He would see her in the corner of his eye, a flash of black feathers, a glimpse of a hooded figure, only for her to vanish when he turned. His dreams became her playground. He would relive his battles, but in these visions, his spear would shatter, his friends would turn on him, and always standing over his body would be the bat, the crow, washing his blood-stained armor in a river of death. He was being isolated, psychologically besieged. The noose was tightening, but it was invisible, woven from fear and prophecy. The final act of her grand design required a catalyst, a way to strip him of the divine protection that made him nearly invincible. Cú Chulainn, like all great Celtic heroes, was bound by Gisa. These were not mere rules or vows. They were sacred, mystical prohibitions placed upon him. To abide by your Gisa was to maintain your spiritual power and good fortune. To break one was to invite disaster, to unravel your own fate. And the Morrigan knew every single one of his. Her plan was diabolical in its simplicity. She would not force him to break his Gisa. She would create a situation where he had no choice, where his own code of honor would be the weapon turned against him. One of Cú Chulainn's most sacred Gisa was that he must never eat the flesh of a dog. His very name, the Hound of Chulainn, was tied to this prohibition. It was the core of his identity. Another of his Gisa was that he could never refuse hospitality, especially a meal offered to him on the road. To do so was the gravest of insults, a stain on his honor he could not bear. Do you see the trap? A divine paradox, a choice with no right answer. As Cú Chulainn rode out to answer a call to battle, a false alarm orchestrated by the illusions of Calatin's children, he came upon a crossroads. There, hunched over a small fire, was an old woman, a crone with one eye and a sinister grin, roasting something on a spit. It was one of the Morrigan's many forms, the hag, the weaver of fate. She called out to him, her voice like grinding stones, offering him a piece of her meal. It was her right to offer, and his duty to accept. To refuse her would be to break his guise of hospitality and dishonor himself before a battle. But as he drew closer, the smell hit him. It was the flesh of a hound. He was caught. The architect had designed the perfect cage. He stood there, the greatest warrior of his age, paralyzed. On one hand, his honor. On the other, his soul. To refuse the old woman was unthinkable for a hero of his stature. It would be an admission of weakness, a public dishonor. But to accept was to knowingly consume the flesh of his namesake, to violate the deepest source of his spiritual power. With a heavy heart, knowing he was being played by a divine hand, he chose what he believed to be the lesser of two evils. He chose to protect his honor. He dismounted, accepted the cooked meat from the smiling crone, and ate it. The moment the forbidden food passed his lips, he felt something inside him die. It was a physical sensation, a cold hollowing out in his chest. The divine power, the Ryastrad or battle frenzy that made him a demigod, felt suddenly distant, muted. The hand he used to take the meat, his left hand, withered slightly, losing some of its strength. He had been poisoned not by the food, but by the breaking of his own sacred law. The first thread of his destiny had been deliberately, irrevocably snapped. He left the crone, who laughed behind him, her laughter echoing the caw of 1,000 crows. He was diminished. He was vulnerable. And the Morrigan knew it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The illusions and omens had been the first wave of attack, designed to weaken his mind. The breaking of his guise was the second, crippling his spirit and his power. Now the third wave was about to crash. The armies of his enemies, led by the sorcerous children of Calatin and fueled by the Morrigan's dark power, were marching for real. The final battle was at hand, and Cú Chulainn, the mighty hound of Ulster, was riding to meet it as a fraction of the man he once was, walking knowingly into a trap from which there was no escape. The architect was ready to see her masterpiece complete. The road to Muirthem was a path paved with omens. The air itself was a shroud, thick with a silence that was louder than any war horn. For Cú Chulainn, every gust of wind felt like a whisper from the Morrigan. Every shadow seemed to twist into the shape of a crow. He was riding with his charioteer, Leg, and his legendary horse, the Grey of Machu, but they were a grim procession. The Grey of Machu had wept tears of blood that morning, refusing to be harnessed until Cú Chulainn himself had pleaded with it. This was not a ride to victory, it was a funeral march. And then they saw them. By the side of the road, 3 hags, ancient and hunched, their faces a roadmap of cruel years. They huddled over a small fire of blackthorn, and spitted on a rowan branch. Over the flames was the carcass of a dog. The smell of roasting meat and bitter smoke filled the air. As Cú Chulainn approached, one of the crones looked up, her eyes like chips of obsidian. She beckoned him with a bony finger. "Great Cú Chulainn," she rasped, her voice like grinding stones. "Do not scorn the food of the common folk. Come share our humble meal." A cold dread, colder than any winter, seized the hero. He was caught. One of his most sacred vows, his hayas, forbade him from ever refusing an offering of hospitality. To do so would bring him immense misfortune and strip him of his honor. But another, more personal hayas, forbade him from ever consuming the flesh of a dog, the very animal for which he was named, the Hound of Chulainn. It was a part of his identity, his power. He was staring at a choice between 2 poisons, a perfectly crafted trap. He knew with a certainty that chilled his very marrow, whose hand had set this snare. This was the Morrigan in her triple form, presenting him with an impossible decision. He could refuse, breaking his vow of hospitality and arriving at the battlefield shamed and weakened. Or he could accept, and consume the flesh that was taboo to him, poisoning himself from the inside out. He looked at the 3 crones, their faces unreadable masks of ancient malice, and he saw no way out. He was the greatest warrior in Ireland, a man who had faced armies single-handedly, but he was powerless before this simple roadside fire. With a heavy heart he dismounted. He walked to the fire, the eyes of the three hags following his every move. He took the piece of cooked meat they offered him. As he ate it, he felt a profound change within him. It was not a physical sickness but something far deeper. A wound not of the flesh but of the soul. A vital part of his strength, his spiritual fortitude, simply vanished. He placed his left hand on his thigh to steady himself, and the hand and thigh were instantly paralyzed, losing all their strength. The price was paid. The trap had sprung. He was no longer whole. He was now a mortal man, limping toward a battle against gods and kings. He mounted his chariot once more, the taste of his own undoing still on his tongue. The journey continued, each turn of the chariot's wheels a drumbeat counting down his final moments. And then he came to a ford, and there he saw her again. This time she was alone, a tall, spectral woman standing knee-deep in the rushing water. Her long hair was the color of blood in the fading light, and she was weeping, a sound of profound, world-ending sorrow. In her hands she held the armor and tunic of a warrior, and she was washing them in the river. As she worked, the water around her churned and swirled crimson, as if she were washing out a grievous, fatal wound. Cú Chulainn stared, his blood running cold. It was his armor, his clothes. He was looking at the Bean Sidhe, the washer at the ford, the Morrigan in her most terrifying prophetic form. She was the harbinger of death, who appeared only to those destined to die in battle, washing their bloody shrouds before they had even fallen. She didn't look at him. She just continued her grim work, her keening wail the only sound besides the rushing water. The river ran red before the blood was ever spilled. There was no ambiguity left, no hope for a clever escape. Fate, in the form of this weeping, terrible goddess, had pronounced his sentence. He was a dead man. He simply hadn't stopped breathing yet. He urged his horses on, leaving the wailing goddess behind, and rode onto the plain of Muirthemne. The army of his enemies was waiting. At their head was Lugaid, the son of one of the many kings Cú Chulainn had slain. And Lugaid held a weapon of terrible power. After the death of Cú Chulainn, a magical spear had been forged for the sole purpose of vengeance. It was prophesied that this spear and two others like it would each kill a king. The battle began. Even diminished, Cú Chulainn was a force of nature. He tore through the ranks of his enemies like a winter storm, his brokenness fueling a desperate, final rage. But the forces arrayed against him were too many, and his fate was already written. Lugaid saw his chance. He called out, "They say a king will fall to this spear." He cast the first of the magical weapons. Cú Chulainn, with his incredible skill, dodged it. But the spear flew past him and struck his loyal charioteer Leg. It pierced him through, and he fell from the chariot dead. Leg, the greatest of all charioteers, was a king in his own right. The first prophecy was fulfilled. Grief-stricken and enraged, Cú Chulainn fought on with even greater fury. He was a whirlwind of death, but he was tiring, his wounds accumulating. Lugaid took up the second spear. "A king will fall to this one too," he shouted, and cast it with all his might. Again, Cú Chulainn moved to avoid it, but the spear found a different target. It struck his magnificent horse, the Grey of Machu, sinking deep into its flank. The great steed, a king among all horses, reared up with a final agonized cry and fell, its lifeblood staining the battlefield. The second prophecy was fulfilled. Now Cú Chulainn stood alone, dismounted, wounded, his charioteer and his horse both slain. He was surrounded. He looked at Lugaid, who now held the third and final spear. Everyone on the battlefield knew what was coming. "And this spear," Lugaid said, his voice ringing with grim finality, "will kill the king of all the heroes of Ireland." He threw the spear. This time there was no dodging. It flew true, striking Cú Chulainn in the side with such force that it tore through his body, spilling his entrails onto the cold ground. It was a mortal wound, a wound no man could survive. But Cú Chulainn was no ordinary man. He would not give his enemies the satisfaction of seeing him fall. He would not die in the mud like an animal. With the last of his strength, he staggered to a tall standing stone, a pillar of granite that rose from the battlefield like a finger pointing to the heavens. Holding his own organs in, he pressed himself against the stone. He took off his belt and, with painstaking effort, tied his body upright to the pillar, so that he would die on his feet, facing his enemies, his sword still clutched in his hand. He would die a king, even in his final breath. The armies of Ireland fell silent. They watched in awe and terror. The great Hound of Ulster was bound to the stone. His head slumped forward, but his presence was still so immense, so intimidating, that no one dared approach. They couldn't be sure if he was truly dead, or if this was some final terrible trick. They waited. And as they waited, a single black crow descended from the gray sky. It landed on Cú Chulainn's shoulder and let out a harsh, triumphant cry. The Morrigan had come to claim her fallen champion, to witness the end of the masterpiece she had so carefully, and so cruelly, brought to completion. This act, this simple landing of a bird, was the final punctuation on the epic of Ireland's greatest hero. For hours, his enemies, the armies of Queen Men, had stood frozen, terrified to approach. They had seen him cut down legions, had witnessed his warp spasm twist him into an inhuman monster. They could not believe that such a force of nature could truly be extinguished. But when the crow landed, when it perched on his shoulder and cried out over the silent battlefield, they knew. The Phantom Queen had given her signal. The great Cú Chulainn was dead. This moment reveals a core truth about the Morrigan that is often overlooked. She is not merely a goddess of slaughter. She is a goddess of the meaning of slaughter. Her presence sanctifies the death, transforming it from a mere biological event into a moment of mythological significance. She is the final arbiter, the one who confirms that a life of glorious violence has met its fated violent end. In this, she acts as a psychopomp, a figure who presides over the transition between life and death. But unlike the solemn guides of other pantheons, her guidance is not gentle. It is a harsh, screaming pronouncement from the edge of a sword. Her role as a harbinger of doom is one of her most terrifying and consistent features. Long before she ever appeared to Cú Chulainn as a beautiful woman, she appeared to him in a more chilling form. As he rode to his final battle, he came across a river ford. There, a young woman was weeping, washing a pile of bloody armor and clothing in the rushing water. Cú Chulainn, recognizing the omens, asked whose armor she was washing. She looked up, her eyes filled with a sorrow that was older than the stones, and she told him it was his own. This is the washer at the ford, one of the Morrigan's most dreaded avatars. To see her is to receive your death sentence. She is not there to bargain or to be persuaded. She is a living, breathing prophecy, a manifestation of an inescapable fate. The warrior who sees her knows his thread has been spun, measured, and is now ready to be cut. There is no hope of survival. The only choice left is how he will meet his end. Will he flee and die a coward? Or will he charge forward and die a hero worthy of the songs? The washer at the ford doesn't just predict death. She forces a final, defining choice upon the doomed. She ensures that a warrior's end is a conscious act, a final blaze of glory before the darkness. This vision of a lone woman at a riverbank, performing a grim and domestic task that foretells immense violence, gets to the heart of the Morrigan's complexity. She is a being of profound contradictions. She is a goddess of war who rarely wields a weapon. She is a force for chaos who is intimately tied to the unchangeable nature of fate. And most confusingly of all, she is not one goddess but three. This is where understanding the Morrigan becomes truly difficult, because our modern minds struggle with the Celtic concept of a triple deity. This isn't the maiden, mother, and crone of modern paganism. This is something far more primal and strange. The Morrigan is a trinity, a single being with three distinct faces, or three sister goddesses who are so intertwined that they are functionally one entity. Their names often shift between stories, but they are most commonly known as Bad, Machu, and Nimain. To understand the Morrigan, you must understand her three faces. First, there is Bad. Her name is often translated as crow, specifically a scald crow, a carrion bird. She is the Bab Catha, the battle crow. Bab is the sheer psychological terror of war. She is the panic that grips a soldier's heart in the moments before a charge. She flies screaming over the battlefield, her voice a cacophony of breaking shields and dying moans, sowing confusion and fear among the ranks. Armies would break and flee not from the swords of their enemies, but from the terrifying shriek of the Bab overhead. She could create phantom armies, illusions of vast hosts appearing on a hillside, to demoralize and scatter her chosen victims. She is not the physical clash of steel, but the mental and emotional breakdown that precedes it. She is the reason a seasoned warrior's hands might tremble, the reason a line of shield bearers might suddenly lose their nerve and turn to run. Bab is the goddess of psychological warfare, the embodiment of the horror that war inflicts upon the mind. Then there is Machu. Of the three sisters, her story is perhaps the most personal, the most tragic, and the most revealing of the Morrigan's connection to sovereignty and the land itself. There are several figures named Machu in Irish mythology, but the one most tied to this triad is a woman of supernatural power who married a mortal farmer. Her husband, in a moment of foolish pride, boasted to the king of Ulster that his wife could outrun the king's fastest horses. The king, intrigued and cruel, demanded she prove it. The problem was Machu was heavily pregnant, on the verge of giving birth. She begged to be spared the ordeal, but the king threatened to execute her husband if she refused. So Machu ran. She ran against the finest horses in the kingdom, her body racked with the pains of labor, and she won. But as she crossed the finish line, she collapsed and gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. And with her last breath, she screamed a curse upon the men of Ulster who had stood by and watched her humiliation. For 9 generations in their time of greatest need, they would be struck down by a weakness as debilitating as the pains of childbirth. This curse, the Sias Ulad, or the debility of the Ulstermen, is the entire reason the 17-year-old Cú Chulainn had to defend the border of Ulster single-handedly. All the other warriors were incapacitated by Machu's dying curse. Machu represents the feminine power of the land, the concept of sovereignty. In ancient Ireland, the king was metaphorically married to the land, which was personified by a goddess. To disrespect the goddess was to bring ruin upon the kingdom. Machu's story is a brutal lesson in what happens when the feminine divine is abused, humiliated, and treated as property. Her vengeance is not swift and clean. It is a deep, abiding curse that echoes through generations. She is the fury of the wronged, the power of the earth itself rising up to punish those who have broken a sacred trust. Finally, there is Numain. Her name means venomous or frenzy. If Bab is the psychological terror before the battle, and Macha is the sovereign justification for the battle, Numain is the pure, chaotic, blood madness of the battle. She is the red mist that descends upon a warrior, stripping away his humanity and turning him into a killing machine. She is the berserker rage, the warp spasm of Cú Chulainn. Numain runs through the battlefield, her cries driving men to such madness that they attack their own comrades, mistaking friend for foe in the heat and confusion of the fight. She is the embodiment of the adrenal, intoxicating, and utterly inhuman state that combat can induce. She is the venom that poisons the soul, the frenzy that leaves a battlefield littered with the bodies of men who, just hours before, were fathers, sons, and brothers. Bab the terror, Machu the sovereign fury, Numain the frenzy, 3 distinct aspects yet all are one. They are not separate goddesses who team up for war. They are facets of a single terrifying whole. The Morrigan is the complete experience of organized violence. She is the premonition of death whispered on the wind. She is the righteous anger that fuels a conflict. She is the strategic confusion that turns the tide. She is the inhuman madness that seizes the warrior. And she is the carrion crow that picks at the bones when it is all over. She is not simply a goddess of war. She is war. And her story, a story written in prophecy, blood, and sovereign power, was far from over. Her greatest and most ambitious manipulation of fate was yet to come, on a windswept plain called Mag Twyard. The Plain of Towers. In the old tongue, that's what it meant. But for the Tuatha De Danann, it had become a plain of tears. After their first great battle on this land, they had known victory. They had established themselves as the masters of Ireland, a shining beacon of art, magic, and nobility. But that light had been dimmed, almost extinguished, not by an outside force, but by a cancer from within. Their king Nuada had lost his arm in that first battle, and by their sacred law, a king could not be blemished. He was forced to abdicate. In his place they chose a new king, Bress. Bress was beautiful, impossibly so, but his beauty was a mask for a rotten core. He was half Fomorian, his father a prince of the shadowy, monstrous race from beneath the waves, and it was to them his loyalty truly belonged. Under Bress's rule, the Tuatha De Danann, the gods of Ireland, were brought low. Their greatest champions were forced into manual labor. Ogma, the champion of eloquence, was made to haul firewood. The Dagda, the great and good god, a figure of immense power and appetite, was reduced to building forts and digging trenches, a slave on his own land. The Fomorians, led by their one-eyed king, Balor of the Evil Eye, imposed crippling taxes. It was a tax on everything, on the smoke from their fires, the flour from their mills, the milk from their cows. Ireland groaned under the weight of this tyranny. The laughter and poetry of the Tuatha Dé fell silent, replaced by the grunts of forced labor and the whispers of rebellion. This was an age of deep shame. The divine order had been inverted. The principles of honor, generosity, and truth that defined their society were trampled under the mud-caked boots of Fomorian tax collectors. And where was the Morrigan in all this? She was watching, always watching. She is the goddess of sovereignty, and she saw a land whose rightful sovereignty was broken, a people whose spirit was being crushed. She is a goddess of prophecy, and she knew this darkness was not an ending, but a crucible, a fire that would forge a new hero. And then he arrived. A young man blazing like the sun walked up to the gates of Tara, the high seat of the kings. He was Luff, and he was everything Bress was not. He was the grandson of Balor of the Evil Eye on his mother's side, but his father was of the Tuatha Dé. He was a perfect fusion of the two warring peoples, yet his heart beat with the fire of the divine. The guard at the gate told him no one could enter Tara unless they possessed a skill that was not already present within. So Luff asked, "Do you have a master smith?" "Yes." "A master, right?" "Yes." "A champion, a harpist, a poet, a historian, a sorcerer?" "Yes, yes, yes," they had them all. Luff's response echoed through the halls of power. "Then ask your king if he has one man who possesses all of these skills, for if he does, I have no need to enter." They brought him before the disgraced King Nuada, who had since been given a new arm of shining silver. Luff's brilliance was undeniable. He was Luff Lamfada, Luff of the long arm, the Ildenak, the master of all arts. He was the prophecy made flesh. The coming of Luff was the spark, the first note in a war drum's beat. Bress was quickly deposed, his reign of tyranny over. But this act of defiance was a declaration of war. The Fomorians would not let their cash cow, the island of Ireland, go so easily. Balor of the Evil Eye gathered his monstrous hordes, his armies covering the sea like a black tide, ready to crush the Tuatha Dé Danann once and for all. The second battle of Mag Twyard was inevitable. As the two sides prepared for the final cataclysmic confrontation, the Dagda, the great father god of the Tuatha Dé, felt the weight of his people on his shoulders. He was a warrior, a builder, a chieftain. But this was a war that would be decided by more than just strength of arms. It would be decided by magic, by will, by fate itself. And so, he went to seek an ally who held dominion over all three. He traveled to the river Unius in the heart of the country, for he knew that on the eve of Samhain, the day the veils between worlds are at their thinnest, she would be there. He found her standing astride the river, one foot on the north bank, one on the south. The water flowed beneath her, a torrent of power. She was washing something in the river, the armor and weapons of a warrior stained with blood. It was a chilling omen, the work of the washer at the ford. But the Dagda was not afraid. He saw her not just as a harbinger of death, but as the key to life, to victory. She was the Morrigan in all her terrible glory, her 9 loosened tresses of hair falling over her shoulders. And as the Dagda approached, she did not challenge him as a foe, but met him as an equal. What happened next is one of the most primal, most potent moments in all of Celtic mythology. There, across the river of fate, the Dagda and the Morrigan came together. This was not an act of simple passion or romance. This was a sacred strategic union. It was a merging of forces. The Dagda represented the strength, the structure, and the paternal protection of his people. The Morrigan represented the chaotic, untamable forces of nature, of fate, of the earth itself, and the sovereignty that springs from it. By joining with him, she was not just giving him her favor. She was binding her power to the cause of the Tuatha Dé Danann. She was consecrating their war, sanctifying their king, and personally guaranteeing their right to rule the land. It was the ultimate act of choosing a side. She was investing herself, body and soul, in their victory. After their union, the Morrigan turned her gaze to the future, to the battlefield that was about to run red. And she spoke a prophecy. It wasn't a vague prediction of what might be. It was a declaration of what would be. She told the Dagda exactly how the battle would unfold. She promised him that she herself would go to the land of the Fomorians and destroy their king, Indek, son of the goddess Damnu. She would, she said, take from him the blood of his heart and the kidneys of his valor. It was a gruesome, visceral promise. She was not just going to kill him, she was going to unmake him, to drain the very essence of his courage and his life force. She then delivered a spell, a poem of power that was both a blessing for her allies and a curse upon her enemies. She chanted of the high-souled men who would fight, of the coming slaughter, and of the doom of the Fomorians. This prophecy was more than just information, it was a weapon. The Dagda returned to the Tuatha Dé encampment not just with a plan, but with a divine guarantee. Imagine the effect this had. Imagine the terror of the Fomorians, hearing whispers that the Phantom Queen herself had sworn to rip the valor from their king's chest. Imagine the surge of courage in the hearts of the Tuatha Dé warriors, knowing that the goddess of fate and victory was marching with them. The Morrigan had played her hand. She had chosen her champion in Luff, legitimized the cause through her union with the Dagda, and demoralized her enemies with a terrifyingly specific prophecy of their demise. The pieces were now in place. The armies were gathering. The air over Mag Twyrd grew thick and heavy, charged with the energy of two worlds about to collide. The Fomorians, with their brute strength and their king whose single glance could kill. The Tuatha Dé Danann, with their divine skill and their new sunbright leader. And hovering over it all, a dark shadow with wings of jet, a screaming fury in her heart, was the Morrigan. She had promised blood, and on that plain she would wade in it up to her knees. The battle for the soul of Ireland was about to begin. The first sound was not the clash of steel, but a deep guttural roar that shook the very stones of the plain. The horns of the Fomorians, carved from the bones of sea monsters, bellowed a promise of drowning and darkness. In answer, the silver trumpets of the Tuatha Dé Danann sang a clear, defiant note of light against the coming night. And then the space between the two armies vanished. It was a wave of flesh and iron crashing upon a shore of the same. Shields splintered into 1,000 pieces, spears found their homes in chests and throats, and the green grass of Mag Twyrd began its slow, hungry drink of red. The Fomorians were a force of nature. Their champions were giants, twisted things of immense power. Bress, the disgraced king, fought with a desperate fury, trying to reclaim his honor with every swing of his heavy axe. Indek, son of the goddess Damnu, moved like a walking mountain, his club pulping men into the mud with sickening thuds. And leading them all was Balor of the Evil Eye. His true weapon, his gaze of death, was still hidden beneath 7 heavy eyelids, but his presence alone was a cancer on the battlefield, a weight of despair that crushed the morale of the Tuatha Dé. For a time it seemed the light would fail. The disciplined lines of the Danann warriors bent and buckled under the sheer, brutal force of the Fomorians. Nuada, with his arm of silver, fought with the grace of a master, but he was one god against a legion. Luff, the Ildenak, the master of all arts, was a whirlwind of spear and sling, but for every Fomorian he struck down, 2 more shambled forward to take its place. The healers of the Tuatha, led by Dien Sect, worked miracles, pulling warriors from the brink of death at the Well of Slain, but even their magic was being overwhelmed. The tide was turning, and it was a black, cold tide from the depths of the sea. The air grew thick with the stench of blood and fear. Hope began to curdle in the hearts of the Danann, and that is when she descended. It began as a change in the sky. The clouds, already gray and grim, boiled into a furious black. A wind, cold as a grave, whipped across the plain, carrying not the scent of rain but of iron and ozone. And from the heart of that storm came a sound. It was not the cry of a crow, not anymore. It was a shriek that peeled the sanity from a man's mind. It was the sound of grinding worlds, of prophecies of ruin, of every nightmare a mortal heart could conceive. The Morrigan fell upon the Fomorian ranks not as a warrior, but as a living plague of terror. She was a shadow that blotted out the sun, a vortex of screaming madness. One moment she was a vast, winged nightmare, her cries causing Fomorian champions to claw at their own eyes. The next, she was a sleek, gray wolf, darting through the chaos, her jaws tearing out the throats of their sorcerers before they could complete their dark incantations. She was a twisting column of black mist, a phantom of dread that seeped into their souls, showing them visions of their own brutal deaths, causing them to turn their weapons on each other in a paranoid frenzy. She did not fight their bodies. She shattered their minds. She unmade their courage. The Fomorians were beings of brute force and dark power, But they had never faced a weapon like this. They had never faced a goddess who wielded fear itself as a blade. The sheer metaphysical wrongness of her presence broke their charge. Their advance slowed, then faltered, then stopped. A wave of confusion and primal terror rippled through their ranks. And into that moment of hesitation, the Morrigan let out one final earth-shattering cry. It was not a sound of despair, but a call to glory, a command, a promise of victory. It washed over the Tuatha De Danann not as fear, but as fire. It burned away their doubt, cauterized their wounds, and filled their veins with an ice-cold rage. Their exhaustion vanished, replaced by a divine fury. This was the Morrigan's gift. The battle madness, the Ryastrad, the sublime and terrifying ecstasy of war. Love felt it most of all. The goddess's power surged through him. He was no longer just a skilled warrior. He was the focal point of a god's wrath. His eyes blazed with a light that mirrored the sun, and he raised his spear, the fearsome Gia Sail, and his voice rang out, clear and powerful, cutting through the din. He called out the names of his kin, of his people, and they answered with a single unified roar that drowned out the Fomorian horns. The tide had not just turned, it had become a tsunami of righteous vengeance. The Tuatha De Danann, renewed and terrible in their fury, charged. The battle became a slaughter. The Fomorians, their morale shattered by the Morrigan's psychological assault, fell like wheat before the scythe. Luff moved through them like a vengeful star, his spear never missing its mark. But he was not seeking just any foe. His eyes were locked on the towering form of Balor of the Evil Eye. Balor saw the charge. He saw his armies breaking. He knew it was time to unleash his ultimate weapon. "Lift my eyelid," he bellowed to his attendants. "Let me see this so-called master of arts who defies me." For Fomorian soldiers struggled with heavy hooks to pry open the first of the 7 lids that shielded his toxic eye. As the first lid lifted, the ferns on the battlefield began to wither and brown. As the second lifted, the grass turned red. With the third, the shields of the Danann began to heat and smoke. Luff knew he had only moments. He ran not on the ground but on the very air, a blur of motion. But just as the 4th eyelid was being raised, a flurry of black feathers descended. A murder of crows, summoned by the Morrigan, swarmed Balor's face. They were a distraction, a momentary chaos, but it was all Luff needed. He took his sling, a simple weapon for such a mighty hero, and placed in it a single smooth stone, a tathlum. He spun it once, twice, 3 times, pouring all his divine power, all the fury of his people, all the dark encouragement of the Morrigan, into that one small projectile. Balor roared, shaking the crows from his face. The 4th lid was open. A sliver of the eye's power was now visible, a sickly purple-black light that promised instant annihilation. He fixed his gaze on Luff, but the stone was already flying. It moved with impossible speed and accuracy. It struck Balor's eye with the force of a thunderbolt. The stone did not bounce off. It drove the eye straight through the back of Balor's skull. The Fomorian king's massive body stood rigid for a moment, a monolith of disbelief. Then the full unleashed power of his own dying gaze erupted from the back of his head, scything through his own Fomorian ranks, turning a third of his own army to dust and fused glass. Balor, the tyrant of the tower, the king of the Fomorians, fell to the earth with a crash that split the ground. The Fomorian army, what was left of it, broke completely. The sight of their invincible leader falling, killed by his own power, was the final blow. They threw down their weapons and fled, a panicked rabble hounded by the avenging Tuatha De Danann. The battle was won. The victory was absolute. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the field of silent bodies, the Morrigan stood with the victorious gods. She had fulfilled her promise, but she was not there to celebrate. Her purpose was not joy but truth. And as the cheers of the Tuatha De Danann faded, she opened her mouth and delivered one last gift to her people. Not a blessing but a prophecy. She spoke of the victory they had just won, but then her voice grew cold, her eyes looking past them into the ages to come. She spoke of a world without honor, of summers without flowers and cows without milk. She spoke of seas without fish, of women without shame and men without strength. She foretold a time of judgment and evil, where sons would turn on fathers, and the bonds of kinship would dissolve into nothing. She prophesied the end of their world, the twilight of the gods, and the coming of a new age. The victorious Tuatha De Danann stood in silence, the chill of her words cutting deeper than any Fomorian blade. They had just saved their world, only to be told that it was doomed to die. The great goddess of war had given them their greatest victory, and in the same breath, she had shown them the shape of their ultimate defeat. She was the Morrigan, the Phantom Queen, and her domain was not just the battlefield of the present, but the inevitable blood-soaked path of fate itself. This prophecy wasn't a curse spoken in anger, but a simple, brutal statement of fact. It was the cosmic balance sheet. The Tuatha Dé Danann had won their place in Ireland through bloodshed and magic, and by that same coin, they would eventually lose it. For a time there was peace. They ruled as a golden, godlike aristocracy, masters of poetry, art, and arcane knowledge. But the shadow of the Morrigan's words lingered. It was a knowledge that sat in the back of their minds at every feast, a whisper on the wind during every hunt. Their age, glorious as it was, had a foretold end, and that end came from the sea. They were called the Milesians, the sons of Mila Spain, a warrior race from the south. They weren't monstrous Fomorians or rival gods. They were something far more dangerous. They were men, mortals filled with ambition, iron will, and a belief that this green island, this Innisfail, was their promised destiny. When their ships first appeared on the horizon, it was not just an invasion. It was the arrival of fate itself, the very doom the Morrigan had foretold. But the Phantom Queen's role in this final chapter for her people is one of the most debated, most mysterious parts of her entire saga. Did she stand with the Tuatha Dé Danann, her battle fury unleashed one last time to defend their kingdom? Or did she, as the arbiter of fate, simply stand back and watch the prophecy she herself had delivered come to pass? The answer, like the Morrigan herself, is not simple. It is a trinity of possibilities. As the Milesians attempted to land, they were not met by armies, but by three majestic queens. They were Eriu, Bamba, and Fadla, the three divine sisters for whom the island was named. Many scholars see these three as aspects of the Morrigan, a different face of her sovereignty. They are the land personified, the spirit of Ireland itself given form and voice. They did not meet the invaders with swords, but with a powerful regal demand. Each queen, in turn, extracted a promise from the Milesian leader, the poet druid Amergin. If they should conquer this land, they must name it in her honor. Amergin agreed, and in that moment something profound shifted. This was not a simple war of extermination. It was a negotiation for legacy. The goddesses, in their wisdom, knew the age of their people was ending. They were ensuring that even in defeat, their spirit, their very name, would be woven into the soul of the land forever. Ireland to this day bears the name of Eriu, but a promise of a name does not surrender a kingdom. The Tuatha Dé Danann were not yet finished. Their druids, masters of the elements, summoned their power. They raised a magical wind, a tempest so fierce it drove the Milesian fleet back from the shore, scattering their ships across a churning, violent sea. They shrouded the island in a magical fog, making it invisible, a phantom realm that mortals could not find. This was not the work of ordinary magic. This was the raw, untamable power of the land itself rising up to defend its children. This was the Morrigan's fury. She was not a figure on a hillside directing troops. She was the storm. She was the shriek of the wind, the crushing power of the waves, the disorienting mist that confounded and terrified the invaders. She was fighting not for a king or a tribe, but for the very soul of her domain. Yet the Milesians had their own power. Amergin, their leader, was more than a warrior. He was a bard, a filly, whose connection to the spirit of the world was as profound as any Tuatha Dé Danann druid. Standing on the prow of his ship, tossed by the phantom storm, he did not fight the magic with magic. He spoke to it. He sang a poem, an incantation of immense power, addressing the very spirit of Ireland. He sang, "I call to the land of Ireland, to the shimmering fruitful sea, to the broad green earth." He wasn't trying to break the spell. He was introducing himself to it. He was laying his own claim, not through dominance but through a deep spiritual connection. He was speaking the land's own language, and the land listened. The storm abated, the mists cleared, the path to the shore was open. The Tuatha Dé Danann's greatest defense had been overcome, not by a greater force, but by a deeper understanding. The battle that followed was fierce, but its outcome was now inevitable. The age of magic was giving way to the age of men. The Tuatha Dé Danann, the Shining Folk, were defeated. But they were not destroyed. This is the crucial point. They were not wiped from the face of the earth. Pact was made. The Milesians would rule the surface of Ireland, the world of sunlight, fields, and human cities. The Tuatha De Danann in turn would retreat. They would go into the other world, the world beneath the soil. They would inhabit the ancient burial mounds and cairns, the Sidhe. They would become the Sidhe, the people of the hollow hills. They did not die. They simply passed from sight, becoming the foundation of all later Irish folklore about the Fae, the gentry, the fair folk. A hidden kingdom, living parallel to our own, forever tied to the sacred places of the island. And the Morrigan? She did not go with them. She could not. Her sisters, her aspects, Eriu, Bamba, and Fodla, may have become queens of this hidden realm, but the Morrigan's domain was larger. She was not just a goddess of the Tuatha De Danann. She was a goddess of Ireland. Her essence was woven into the fabric of the land itself, the bloody soil of the battlefield, the dark waters of the river, the stark cry of the crow. She remained. Her role now shifted from an active participant in the wars of gods to something far more primal and enduring. She became a force of nature and fate that the new mortal inhabitants would have to reckon with. She was no longer a queen leading an army, but a presence felt in the turning of the seasons and the tide of battle. She was the washer at the ford, glimpsed at the edge of a stream, washing the bloody armor of a man doomed to die. She was the shriek of the Bean Sidhe, the banshee, a cry not of malice, but of terrible, sorrowful foreknowledge, a warning to the great families of Ireland that death was at their door. She became the guardian of the sovereignty itself. Kings would rise and fall, not just by the strength of their armies, but by their relationship with the land, and by extension with her. To rule Ireland was to be wedded to the land, and the Morrigan was its fiercest, most uncompromising spirit. To displease her, to disrespect the natural order, to rule with injustice, was to invite ruin. She was the ultimate kingmaker and kingbreaker, her favor a fleeting, terrifying necessity for any mortal who dared to wear a crown. This transition marks the most profound evolution in her story. She watched the godlike race she once championed fade into myth, replaced by fallible, short-lived mortals. Yet she endured. She adapted. Her power was not diminished. It was simply transformed. It became quieter, more insidious, more deeply embedded in the everyday fears and beliefs of the people. She was no longer just a goddess of war between great armies, but a goddess of the individual's fate, of the clash between ambition and destiny, life and death. She was the shadow that walked beside every great warrior, every ambitious chieftain, a constant, chilling reminder that all glory is temporary, and that the Phantom Queen is always watching, waiting for her inevitable due. But what happens when the world she watches over begins to change? What happens when new gods arrive, with new laws and a new vision for humanity's soul? The Phantom Queen, the weaver of fate, found herself facing a destiny she could not unmake: the slow, inexorable fading of her world. The arrival of Christianity in Ireland was a tide that threatened to wash away the old gods entirely. The sacred groves were cut down, the old stories were rewritten, and the powerful deities of the Celts faced a choice: be forgotten, be demonized, or be transformed. For a goddess as potent and terrifying as the Morrigan, simple forgetting was never an option. Her shadow was cast too long, her cry echoed too deeply in the Irish soul. Instead, she was fractured. Her more terrifying aspects, her delight in slaughter and her grim prophecies of doom, were easily cast into the role of a demon, a malevolent spirit haunting the dark places of the world. The Church had a simple and effective narrative: the old gods were not gods at all, but devils and liars leading mankind astray. The Great Queen, the washer at the ford, became a fiend, a creature of nightmare to frighten children and keep the faithful on the straight path. But her power was too complex to be contained by a simple label of evil. Her other aspects, her sovereignty, her connection to the land, her profound wisdom and magic, were too deeply woven into the fabric of Celtic identity to be completely erased. And so, she underwent a different kind of transformation. She went into hiding, not in the otherworld but in plain sight, cloaked in new stories, wearing a new name. Her most famous and enduring disguise is one you almost certainly know: Morgan Le Fay. The connection is so striking it's impossible to ignore. Say the names aloud: Morrigan. Morgan. The linguistic echo is the first clue. In the burgeoning legends of King Arthur, which drew heavily from older Celtic myths, a powerful, enigmatic sorceress emerges. a woman of noble birth, often a queen herself, who walks the line between ally and antagonist to the great hero Arthur. Just as the Morrigan tested and tormented Cú Chulainn, Morgan Le Fay challenges the Knights of the Round Table. Consider the parallels. The Morrigan is a master shapeshifter, appearing as a beautiful woman, an old hag, a crow, or a wolf. Morgan Le Fay is one of the most powerful sorceresses in all of literature, her magic often involving illusion and transformation. The Morrigan is a prophetess who foretells the death of heroes. Morgan Le Fay is often portrayed as having the gift of foresight, understanding the threads of fate that bind the characters around her. Both are figures of immense, untamable female power, operating outside the conventional rules of patriarchal society. They are not wives or mothers in the traditional sense. They are forces of nature, sovereign unto themselves. The Morrigan has her otherworld domains, islands of magic and mystery. Morgan Le Fay has her own mystical isle, Avalon, the Isle of Apples, a place between worlds where she rules as queen, a place of healing and magic. And in the end, when Arthur is mortally wounded at the Battle of Camlan, a battle that reeks of the Morrigan's influence, a catastrophic conflict between kin, it is Morgan Le Fay, one of 3 queens in a black boat, who comes to carry him away to Avalon. Who else but the goddess of death, fate, and sovereignty would be there at the end to ferry the greatest king to his final rest, his passage into legend. The washer at the ford has become the healer on the boat, but her role as the arbiter of the hero's final destiny remains unchanged. Through Morgan Le Fay, the Morrigan survived the Christianization of Europe. She was laundered in a way. Her raw, bloody, battlefield fury was toned down for the sensibilities of medieval courtly romance. She became less of a screaming war goddess and more of a subtle, scheming enchantress. The carrion crow was replaced by the Book of Spells. But the essence, the power, the mystery, the deep connection to fate and the hidden workings of the world endured. She became a key archetype in Western literature. The powerful, morally ambiguous sorceress, a figure who represents the wild, untamed magic that exists just beyond the borders of the civilized world. But her spirit didn't just hide in Arthurian legend. It splintered into other folkloric figures as well. Think of the banshee, the bean sidhe, or woman of the fairy mound. This spectral figure, whose keening wail foretells a death in a family, is a direct echo of the Morrigan's role as the washer at the ford. She is no longer washing the bloody armor of a king on the eve of battle, but her cry serves the exact same purpose. It is the announcement of fate's decree. It is the sound of the otherworld intersecting with our own to mark the moment of a soul's passage. The terror of the battlefield has been domesticated into a family tragedy, but the messenger remains a supernatural woman, a harbinger of death. For centuries, this is how the Morrigan existed. As a whisper and echo, a character in a story, a frightening folktale. She was a disarmed goddess, her power fragmented and her name largely forgotten by all but scholars and storytellers. But the cycles of fate that she once governed turn in ways no one can predict. In the modern era, something remarkable has happened. The Phantom Queen is re-emerging from the mists. In a world searching for meaning beyond established structures, many have begun looking back to the old ways, to the pre-Christian beliefs of their ancestors. In modern pagan and Wiccan traditions, the Morrigan is being reclaimed and re-honored not as a demon, but as a powerful and necessary goddess. She is seen as a patron of warriors, yes, but also of activists, of survivors, of those who must fight for their own sovereignty in a challenging world. She is an icon of female empowerment, a figure who refuses to be tamed, defined, or controlled by anyone. Her connection to prophecy and magic resonates with those seeking a deeper, more intuitive understanding of the universe. She has also stormed the gates of popular culture. You can find her or characters explicitly based on her in novels, in video games, in television shows. We are once again fascinated by this dark, complex, and powerful female archetype. Why now? Why is this ancient goddess of war, fate, and death finding such fertile ground in the 21st century imagination? Perhaps it's because we live in a time of profound and often violent transformation. The world is churning. Old certainties are dying and new uncertain futures are being born. In such an age, a goddess who presides over the chaos of battle, who is unafraid of death, and who holds the threads of destiny in her hands, feels less like a relic of a forgotten past and more like a reflection of our turbulent present. She represents the terrifying, exhilarating, and necessary process of destruction and rebirth. She is the storm that clears the way for new growth, She is the personal battle that must be fought to achieve self-sovereignty. She is the chilling reminder that we are not entirely in control, that there are ancient and powerful forces at play in the universe, and that fate, in the end, will claim us all. The modern world, with all its technology and rationalism, has tried to sanitize death, to control chaos, to predict the future. But we are learning that these things cannot be fully contained. And so we find ourselves looking back into the shadows, and we see a dark-feathered queen looking back, her eyes filled with an ancient and unnerving wisdom. She was never truly gone. She was only waiting. The question we must now ask ourselves is, what is she waiting for? What great battle, what turn of the wheel is she heralding for us right now? To understand what she's waiting for, we have to stop looking at the battlefields of the past. We have to stop scanning the horizon for longships and Roman legions. Because the Morrigan was never just about the clash of iron on iron. She was about the moment of decision, the tipping point, the fulcrum upon which fate itself pivots. Her battlefields are not always fields of mud and blood. Sometimes they are the battlefields of the human heart, the war for the soul of a culture, the struggle for an idea. Look around you. Do you not see her work? Do you not feel the ground shifting beneath your feet? We live in an age of unprecedented, dizzying change. Old structures are crumbling. Old certainties are dissolving like mist in the morning sun. Ideologies clash not with swords, but with words and images, broadcast to millions in an instant. This is a war of narrative, a war of identity, a war for the very definition of truth. This is a battlefield tailor-made for a goddess of fate, prophecy, and sovereignty. The Morrigan isn't waiting for a war. She is presiding over one that is already happening. She is the whisper of doubt in the tyrant's ear. She is the sudden, electrifying courage in the heart of the protester. She is the uncomfortable truth that shatters a comfortable lie. She is the force that demands we evolve whether we want to or not. She is the patron goddess of the paradigm shift. In the ancient world, she offered a choice to heroes like Cú Chulainn: glory and a short life, or obscurity and a long one. She laid the consequences bare. And she does the same for us today. She asks us, what are you willing to fight for? What are you willing to let die so that something new can be born? This is the terrifying aspect of her power. It's not just about ending the lives of our enemies. It's about ending the parts of ourselves that are holding us back. The Morrigan is the ultimate agent of transformation, and transformation is always a kind of death. To become who you are meant to be, you must kill the person you have been. You must let old identities, old beliefs, and old comforts burn away. She is the washer at the ford for our outdated selves, wringing out the bloody rags of our past mistakes and limitations, showing us what must be cleansed, what must be left behind on the riverbank if we are to cross to the other side. This is why she frightens us. We are culturally conditioned to seek light, comfort, and ease. We want our gods to be gentle shepherds and benevolent fathers. The Morrigan is none of these things. She is the storm. She is the carrion crow that picks the bones clean. She is the darkness that reveals the stars. She is the raw, untamed, sovereign power of nature itself, which does not care for our comfort. It cares only for the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. To embrace the Morrigan is to embrace the most feared and powerful parts of yourself. It is to look into your own shadow, the repository of your rage, your ambition, your ruthlessness, and not flinch. Carl Jung, the great psychologist, spoke of integrating the shadow. He argued that until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our life and we will call it fate. The Morrigan is this process. She is the goddess who demands you stop calling your unacknowledged power fate and start calling it choice. She teaches us that true power isn't about dominating others. It's about sovereignty over the self. The concept of sovereignty is her greatest gift. In the myths, she was the one who granted kingship. A king could not rule the land unless he was symbolically married to the land itself, and she was its personification. He had to be worthy of her, to be in right relationship with her. This is a profound metaphor for our own lives. The land is your own life, your body, your mind, your potential. To have sovereignty is to rule your own kingdom. It is to be the sole and rightful author of your own story. It means you are not ruled by the expectations of others, by the fears instilled in you by society, or by the limitations you have placed upon yourself. Are you worthy of your own life? Are you in right relationship with your own power? This is the question she poses, not with words but with challenges. Every obstacle, every moment of crisis, every dark night of the soul. This is her test. Will you abdicate your throne and let fear rule in your stead? Or will you claim your crown? Claiming it requires the wisdom of all her faces. It requires the prophetic insight of Anu, the ability to see the patterns, to understand the great turning of the wheel in your own life. It requires the fierce, protective, warrior energy of Machu, the will to build your fortress, to defend your boundaries, and to fight for what you are creating. And it requires the terrifying power of Bab, the battle crow. The fury that gives you the strength to tear down what must be destroyed. The righteous rage to say no more. No more to the job that is killing your spirit. No more to the relationship that diminishes you. No more to the internal voice that tells you you are not enough. This is why her symbolism endures. The crow, the raven. These are not just birds of death. They are among the most intelligent creatures on earth. They are messengers, problem solvers, keepers of secrets. When you see a raven, you are not just seeing an omen of war. You are seeing a symbol of a higher perspective. The bird's eye view. The ability to rise above the chaos of the battlefield and see the entire landscape, to see the paths and possibilities that are invisible from the ground. She offers us this sight, this terrible and beautiful clarity. So, when we ask what the Morrigan is waiting for, we are asking the wrong question. She is not waiting. She is acting. Through every person who stands up and reclaims their power. Through every artist who creates a work of radical truth. Through every soul who chooses to walk through the fire of transformation, instead of remaining in the cold comfort of stagnation. She is here now, in the thunderclap of revelation, in the silent, steely resolve to change. The ancient Celts did not worship her out of morbid fascination with death. They honored her because they were realists. They understood that life is a constant state of conflict, that peace is a temporary truce, that creation is impossible without destruction, that to be truly vibrantly alive, one must be willing to engage with the dark, powerful and chaotic forces of existence, both in the world and within oneself. She is not a goddess you pray to for comfort. She is a goddess you invoke for strength. You do not ask her to make your path easy. You ask her to make you worthy of the path. She is the primordial force that pushes the seedling through the hard earth, the volcano that builds new land, the storm that clears the dead wood from the forest. She is the necessary terror. Her story is not over. It was never confined to the pages of Irish mythology. It is a living story, and we are all characters in it. The great battle she heralds is the eternal battle for the sovereign self. Her prophecies are not written in stone, but in the choices we make every single day. The call of the crow is not an echo from a forgotten past. It is a summons, a challenge issued to you right now, to look at the battlefield of your own life, to see what must be defended, what must be destroyed, and what must be born anew. She offers no easy victory, only a worthy fight. The question is, and always has been, will you answer the call?